We have with us eminent journalist, writer, thinker, observer of Indian politics, economy, finance, Swaminathan Iyer. Further introductions will be given by my friend Dhirendra Kumar, who will moderate this session. And Swami has a flight to catch, so I'll just get out of the way. Dhirendra, please take over.
I doubt if there is anyone in this gathering who doesn't know that Swaminathan Iyer is one of the most distinguished economists and journalists. However, I'm going to tell you something about him that you won't know. In fact, he himself may no longer remember it. For me personally, the best thing he ever did was to kickstart value research. And that was so long ago that at that time, Sachin Tendulkar had scored only 4 centuries. So, and that was in the context, when the first flush of liberalization, P.V. Narasimha Rao permitted the disinvestment of PSU. And I was still in my college. While coming back from college, I just walked into his office with a set of reviews, and he was a ready buyer. And that is how value research came into being. Value research did not start as a mutual fund tracker. It started as, my first published work was courtesy him. And so I found everything about, about those PSU companies at a phase when not much was known about him. So it was a very wildly ambitious thing, and it was, extremely courageous and thoughtful of him to give me that opportunity. And so all that I do today got started to a flying start only because he acknowledged it. And from there on, I moved on, changed my track to tracking mutual fund. And that was another interesting story. While in the context of that, publishing those PSU series, I shared with him one fact that at end of '93, mutual funds were only closed-end funds, not of the kind that we see today. And when I appraised him of every fund in this country trading at a huge premium, he just asked me to prepare a scorecard and started initiated the publication of that in the Economic Times Investor Guide every Monday. In about 4 months' time, that power of information I understood and perceived, which I had no sense of, the magnitude of it, that all funds which used to trade at premium started trading at a discount the moment the net asset value was disclosed to those funds. Just to give you a historical context, the mutual fund NAV, the statutory position of those closed-end funds was that it had to be calculated every quarter and published in the next 2 months. So now what you see is a completely different mutual fund. So I would not like to take any more time. And just to give his introduction, he has been the editor of Economic Times and Financial Express. He has been the Indian correspondent of The Economist for 2 decades. His Swanomics columns, as well as their anthology Escape from the Benevolent Zookeepers, are required reading for anyone with any interest in Indian business, finance, and economics. He's currently a research fellow at Cato Institute, one of the world's leading libertarian think tanks. So, not taking any more time, over to you, Swami.
Thank you. I was told that I need to focus on the political economy. You guys have probably heard more than enough on the economic data on what's happening on the economy. The question is, what about the political economy? I think I'll start by saying India was this country which was doing 8.5% growth for a decade and suddenly collapsed at 5%. And people are saying, what is it that's gone wrong at the center and so on. The point I tried to make repeatedly was that it was not some magic of Manmohan Singh or Montek Ahluwalia that produced this 8.5% growth. India began to grow at 8.5% for a decade, largely because the backward Bimaru states, which earlier on used to grow at half the rate of the coastal states until 2002 till 2003, they suddenly picked up steam after 2003. Then the question is, what was it that changed? Because truly it got transformed. Uttar Pradesh and Bihar were seen as the classic examples of this big Hindi heartland which is dragging down the whole of India. I mean, you must have heard that old joke that at independence when Jinnah was asking Nehru saying, I must have Kashmir. And Nehru is supposed to have said, you can have Kashmir only on condition that you take UP and Bihar also. because that will solve our economic. I mean, this is the kind of view that we had of this Gangetic Plain, and therefore we had this Professor Ashish Bose creating this acronym called BIMARU, which is an acronym for Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, and if you added Orissa. And it was a pun because BIMARU also means that there are 6 states. But these states were dragging down the rest of India from independence till about 2003. After 2003, these states began to grow faster than the other states. It took a little time for the data to come out and for this to become a convincing trend. But to my mind, the biggest political economy change, therefore, has been the transformation of the Hindi heartland, or the transfer, it includes Orissa, so shall we say, of that the backward central and North Indian thing. The transformation is not complete. As I say, UP is still fairly Bimaru. It has not overcome, it has not become a fast-growing state like Bihar or more recently like Madhya Pradesh. And yet to me, I mean, the change is something miraculous. Madhya Pradesh was a place where nobody, when Digvijay Singh was there, they said there's no Bijli, no Sadak, no Pani. That's why he lost that particular election. I was in Washington last year when Shivraj Singh Chauhan, Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh, came over. And he was having the temerity to tell Americans that Bijli, Sadak, Pani is there and you have to come here. And he said, I know all of you are worried that India's growth rate has fallen to 6.5%. I'm glad to tell you that Madhya Pradesh's rate has gone up to 11. So here you had the Chief Minister of one of the most backward states saying that, forget all those other guys, come here. I mean, it was an unthinkable kind of thing happening. Or like Nitish Kumar in Bihar becoming some kind of role model, where I find every NGO, every World Bank, ADB, everybody is landing up, touching Nitish Kumar's feet and saying, please tell me how can I give you some more money? And the planned spending in that state from Lalu's time of 2,000 crores, last year is 30,000 crores, 15 times increase in planned spending, and people want to spend more and more. So I said, in terms of the political economy change, I think, I mean, the moment you got Sonia Gandhi and the Congress coming in, there was some idea of this great dream team coming together. In fact, all reform, all attempt, all focus on growth disappeared. Growth was taken for granted. It was somehow taken as some kind of Indian inheritance, as sacred as the Gandhi family, to be there forever. And the only question was, what do you do with it? And we suddenly got this very fast growth, which was giving additional revenue of more than 100,000 crores a year. That was the rate at which revenue was increasing. So the question was, how do I spend this bonanza? But as to what is creating the bonanza, it was being taken for granted as some kind of birthright. Those happy days then came to an end. I mean, if you want to take a broadly, I would say from 91 to 2004, the question constantly being asked out by the political system and the message sent to the bureaucracy used to be, what shall we reform next? So even though you had the Congress from 91 to 96, then you had a third front, then you had the NDA, the question constantly was, what do we reform next? That question stopped being asked in 2004, and we got into this phase of, what do we give away next? How do we distribute? How do we get this inclusiveness? And then in 2008, when the Western financial crisis came, they said, we knew this all the time. So from 2008, what do we regulate next? The message to the bureaucracy from 91 to 2003 was, what do we liberalize next? That message has got reversed. India is definitely going in the area of more and more and more controls. The kind of control has changed. The controls are very much more in terms of environment, forest, tribal, land acquisition. I think these are the 4 big areas. But because we are in a coalition era, whenever a reform thing is put forward, everybody's opinion is taken on board. So if there are 20 lobbies wanting additional conditions, those conditions are also put. So I think we have now got to a stage where on many of these issues, if you want to honestly implement that law, the amount of technical and administrative expertise required does not exist. If you seriously want to implement just your environmental laws, do you have your technical and administrative capacity to do the proper environmental assessment in each case and then implement it properly? And the answer is no. We have now just added the land acquisition to that. In the case of the Land Acquisition Act now, there is supposed to be a social impact assessment for any land acquisition as to, what is the impact on society? Can we change it? If I move this 25 miles away, will I have a different social impact? The social impact study then is supposed to go to an expert committee, which will decide on it. And only if the expert committee then says, okay, then the administration can start work. There can be legal challenge at the level of the social impact assessment. There can be legal challenge at the expert committee level. I mean, you just think about it. Right now, what is the state of a typical state administration? Because of a large number of problems of finance, you will find that up to 1/3 of all posts are vacant. I was horrified in the case of Nitish Kumar, Bihar, which has so much, 1/3 of the judicial posts are vacant. Huge vacancies in schools, huge vacancies in health services. I went to Punjab. Punjab agriculture and university staff have not been paid for 3 months. I said the capacity of the system to deliver old things is not there. I was there at the election rally of Sonia Gandhi at Muzaffarnagar, I remember. And I was asking the SP, I said, you know, in terms of what is the quality of the administration, are you able to manage the crime in this particular area because Western UP? He says, no question of tackling crime. I said, excuse me, this is the superintendent of police at a Sonia Gandhi rally. I said, but why do you say that? He says, sir, we are barely able to keep a lid on communalism and public order. We are fully stretched, just preventing this kettle from boiling over. So we are fully stretched in that and in VIP duty. Over and above that, if you ask me merely to detect burglary, crime, we have no ability to do that. So there's a highly stretched administration with a limited capacity. And we are heaping on that limited thing more and more rules on environment, forest, tribals. It can't be done. So if it can't be done, what happens? Kamal Nath had the answer. He said, you pay me 15% and I give you the clearance. So here was the gentleman, he was environment minister, then he was roads minister, the 15% mantra spread. So we had a system where honestly you couldn't really do any of these projects. The system couldn't do it. With bribery, you could get the clearances. That stopped with the Anna Hazare movement, with the Controller and Auditor General's report, with the backlash against the most brazen kind of corruption and the brazen coup d'etat. So the political backlash was terrible and there was a legal backlash. Every single activist could go to the courts. And we found that on almost any administrative decision, you can appeal against it and the courts are entering. Area after area after area. I mean, why, for instance, courts are getting into, shall we say, genetically modified foods is beyond me. I mean, you may have a good or a bad opinion, but surely it's not a legal matter. But nevertheless, on each and every issue, you find that the activists will come and the court will stop it and appoint its own committee. And if you say that you guys are exceeding your brief, they will say, you know, what are we to do when the executive is brazenly neglecting its duty? I mean, consider a case like India has one of the largest reserves of iron ore in the whole world. We are a major exporter. Today you are importing iron ore. Why? Because illegal mining had become so brazen that to somehow, you know, some things are done clandestinely, like robbery or so on. Mining iron ore cannot be done clandestinely. I mean, there are acres and acres and you need these large machines. They have to scoop it up, they have to load them up. I mean, nothing can be done clandestinely in iron ore mining. And yet massively illegal stuff was going on. In effect, every single state government was in cahoots with the crooks. Otherwise, it couldn't have happened. So first they tried, first of all, they banned, if you remember, all exports from ports in Karnataka. Again, amazing thing. I mean, you don't distinguish between legal and illegal. You say that my administrative apparatus is so third rate, I cannot distinguish between legal and illegal, so I ban all exports. So instead of going from Karnataka, it began to go through Andhra to other places. Then you ban it there. Finally, the Supreme Court says, I ban all mining in these states. And then one by one, I'll open the mines. On the one hand, it looks an outrageous state of affairs that every honest miner was also closed down. So there was grave injustice to the honest miner. But the Supreme Court says that, you know, when the executive is refusing to make this distinction between legal and illegal, I have to step in and start from scratch. And if this is going to hold up all iron ore for the next 2 years, so be it. So this is one example and many, many more. So we have a state of affairs where we have created the proliferation of new rules and regulations. This is the new license permit Raj. The old one related to industrial licensing, import licensing, foreign exchange control. Those were the old style controls. In that case, it was possible to make a bonfire and say, get the hell, let it finish and liberalize. In the case, I'm afraid, of environment, tribal, forest, you cannot make a bonfire of the rules. We have to have rules on the environment. We have to protect the forests. Tribal fellows, it's there in the constitution, their rights. Land acquisition is a real issue, you can't. So I said, the political system now faces a challenge. The challenge is, how do you make the system much more honest, much more functioning, and yet you make enough money to service the needs of politics? This is something which will have to evolve state by state, area by area. There will be no magic formula. I had originally thought within 1 year the political system will be able to evolve. It has not happened. Perhaps it's going to take 2 years, 3 years. But until we are able to check this particular problem, I do not think we will return to fast economic growth. So the economic growth has gone down. Anybody who thinks only in terms of economic parameters, I think is missing the issue altogether. There are these deep political economic considerations. And I have enough faith in the flexibility and the ingenuity of our politicians that they will find a way out. But it's not easy. Having enacted all these rules on environment, forest, how do you then streamline the thing to get quick clearances? I mean, there are people going to Indonesia and Africa. I mean, I talked to one guy, and he said, he was just a medium fellow. I said, but Africa is solidly corrupt. How can you? He says, here I pay and nothing happens. In Africa, I pay and I'm able to go ahead. So he says, in Africa, I can open a coal mine in 3 years. In India, it's taking 10 years, 12 years to open a coal mine after paying money. I mean, we had this great coal scam apparently of Mr. Kumar Birla, right? The thing fell down. The coal scam was, do you know, he was unfairly allotted this coal block in 2005. Nobody mentions that 2005, the allotment, it has not produced 1 ton so far. Where is the bonanza? What is this huge favor that was done? If he paid for it, he must surely be regretting the fact that he made a payment on a completely dud investment. I mean, this is not what crony capitalism is. This is just extortion, or a mixture of extortion and inefficiency. So I said, we need to get back to a system. You cannot go back to the Kamal Nath system of paying 15% on everything. There will have to be some new system evolved. Only when that takes place, I think, our growth will accelerate again. This is one of the major issues. The silver lining in all this, as I said, in many of the backward areas, many of the backward states, the chief ministers have been able to make the system work. It is not that even when various things are held up, a purposeful chief minister is able to get decisions, is able to get clearance and move forward. This is not uniformly true, of course. Mr. Naveen Patnaik has been trying to get POSCO clearance for a steel plant in Odisha for 12 years. And even though the chief minister is for it, they have not quite managed to get it. But at the end of it, I think they have probably seen the light at the end of the tunnel there. And the Tata Kalinganagar thing, I think, is actually supposed to start in a few months' time. So after all these years, something is cracking out there. But as long as we have these purposive chief ministers, that is the big silver lining. And at that level, I think, even if you don't get clearances everywhere, perhaps you will begin to see changes in some states. Many people are asking what's going to happen in the coming election. Who will be the Prime Minister? Non-stop talk, Modi versus Rahul. The newspapers are full of it. To my mind, this is not a very important issue. To my mind, if I look at the experience of the last 10 years and what drove fast growth, this is a country driven by CMs and not PMs. The chief ministers, in my view, are more important than the prime ministers. Prime ministers have a limited amount of power. Now, the prime minister certainly has power in foreign affairs, defense, imports, the external areas, he has power. But when dealing with the Indian population, it's all done through state government officials. Any order that Manmohan Singh gives has to be implemented on the ground level by state government administrations. And if the state government administration is not functioning, it really does not matter what Manmohan Singh says. I mean, one example of this is they have cleared 3 lakh crore, 3 trillion rupee worth of projects are supposed to have been cleared from last September onwards. Only in this country could you clear 3 trillion rupees worth of projects and there is no increase in orders for capital goods. Completely dead, exactly where it is. And it appears the answer is that, so what if you've got some supposed clearance in New Delhi, but if the forest, tribal, environmental, land acquisition is all in the state governments, that is where the action needs to take place. So merely a prime minister saying, I have cleared the project, at this point becomes meaningless. Once upon a time in the old regime, the big hurdle was the license, industrial license. If you got the industrial license, all other doors automatically opened. Today there is no need for that license, but all the other doors don't automatically open. So I said, it's at the state level that we need to focus. So the notion that if Mr. Narendra Modi becomes Prime Minister, somehow everything will begin to function in New Delhi as it is functioning in Gujarat. I said, sorry, in Gujarat, Modi is in charge of the administration. Any officer doesn't do his bidding, he's transferred, he's sent to some other post. The system of reward and punishment, the bureaucracy is extremely alert, extremely sensitive to the needs of the chief minister. Anything he wants done gets done like this. If he attempts to do the same thing from New Delhi, nobody will listen to him. Everybody, every official is listening to the chief minister. He is not listening to the prime minister. The official is not accountable to the prime minister. So the limited number of guys in defense, foreign affairs, those areas may be. But where the bulk of the population is concerned, Mr. Modi will find that he's in a very uncomfortable position. Even if by some chance he's elected with a massive majority, he will not be able to function as he did in Gujarat. But let's get to anybody who thinks Modi is going to get elected with a massive majority, to my mind, is living in some kind of fantasy land. I just took a bet with somebody else Dipankar Gupta, a famous sociologist. He says BJP will get 220. So I've taken a bet of a meal at Oberoi, with the winner deciding what's to be ordered. So that can become 20,000 rupees. It can be an expensive meal. But 220 I think is absolutely fool's game. Probably 150, 160 is closer to the thing. If you get a situation, even where the BJP has 180, and then you need another 90 from other people, a chief minister like Raman Singh or Shivraj Chauhan or Naveen Patnaik or Nitish Kumar, you can give orders and get them done. If you are in New Delhi and you have 180 seats and there are 90 other seats belonging to other parties, none of whom you dare antagonize because you are dependent on them, you need to realize where the power structure is. People are used to the idea that the Prime Minister can discipline the cabinet ministers because the cabinet ministers are dependent on the Prime Minister. I am afraid we are getting a situation where the cabinet posts are decided first and they then decide who will be Prime Minister. It is very far from clear that if the BJP comes to power at a ramshackle coalition, the partners may say we will do it provided it is not Modi but it's Advani, or provided it is some non-entity like Arun Jaitley, whom they will feel more comfortable with because he doesn't pose any kind of threat. So I said once again, if we go back to the last third front government that we had, we've been through this between 1996 and 98. There was a so-called third front government supported from outside by the Congress party. So Mr. Sitaram Kesri, running the Congress party, said by remote control I will actually run this government. He tried and actually his remote control did not work. The idea that you can be outside and somehow you will be consulted on every decision and you will run it, it turned out not to be the case. Deva Gowda ran it for 11 months, Sitaram Kesri got him sacked, Inder Gujral came in. And then finally at the end of about 2 years, they said, well, let's go for fresh elections. But one thing that came, two or three things came up clearly. First, trying to run this kind of third front by the so-called anchor party, they call it. They say that, if there's any coalition, that the BJP or Congress has to be an anchor. Mr. Sitaram Kesri tried to be an anchor but found that he was only floating on top and the other parties were the real anchor. He was unable to really function. I think you will face a similar danger right now. The second thing that you discovered, I said, was a weak Prime Minister but strong cabinet ministers. And it's worth going back once again to that particular period to fully understand this. Deva Gowda had landed up from out of nowhere. He had come to the center and he said, very good, what do Prime Ministers do? Sir, you go on ceremonial visits abroad. Very good, he says. So he arranged a trip and he visited Singapore to improve relations and says, Southeast Asia. And so out there they said, sir, we have this problem. He said, tell me. He said, we have this joint venture we are proposing, Singapore Airlines and Tata's. And it has been in the works, but it's not going through. He said, I'll see to it, we'll go through. And they were very, very happy and there was a lot of applause. Prime Minister of India has approved it. So then the Singaporeans land up in New Delhi. Huh? And I said, no. I said, excuse me? I said, is this a country where a civil aviation minister can overrule a prime minister? They said, yes. Then they said, why is this so? I mean, is the civil aviation a communist? Is it some other party? They said, sir, he is Mr. Ibrahim, he belongs to Mr. Devagowda's own party. You could not discipline a cabinet minister of your own regional party, let alone anybody else. So, Mr. CM Ibrahim was single-handedly able to completely sabotage any foreign airline coming in. On the other hand, there was another minister called Chidambaram. And as finance minister, while this was supposed to be a left-wing combination, he was included the Communist Party of India, he had this famous dream budget of cutting taxes, liberalizing and saying we are going to go the ASEAN way. He was able to do it because the Prime Minister had no control over him. It was a case of having powerful cabinet ministers and a weak Prime Minister. You might see the same kind of political economy playing out after 2014. You might once again see that there's that hodgepodge of guys. What else do we learn from that episode? As I said, it was a reasonably well-run administration. The growth rate remained 7.5% the first year. Second year, they were hit by the Asian financial crisis. Asian financial crisis laid low most countries in Asia, and most of the governments got toppled, overthrown. Here, the third front government stood up to it. We stood up to the full force of that and overcame it. So, in no way can it be said that our experience of this ramshackle coalition without an anchor, powerless prime minister, the system worked perfectly well within those parameters. In those, I mean, it was not a great administration, but in no sense did it perform significantly worse than the preceding or the next one. So I said, if there are some people who say, oh my God, hung parliament coming up once again, I said, no problem. Not only is it going to be a hung parliament, but it may be, in fact, the permanent state of affairs which we'll have to deal with. We have got used to the idea of thinking that the natural scheme of affairs in India is to have all India parties. And there is the odd regional party and there are minor players. I am sorry, if there is one single lesson from the last 20-25 years, it is that the all India parties are steadily losing ground, and the parties based on religion, region and the caste, these are the fellows coming up. And the idea that this is a temporary phase and we will somehow go back to the all India parties, to me it does not follow. I don't know what will happen. But I will simply say this, it is entirely possible that we will see more and more situations where loose coalitions of state parties are the ones that will rule India rather than the all India formations. Okay, I think I've said enough.
One question. Just in case you lose your bet.
Yes.
And Narendra Modi, which
with 220 seats, yeah.
220 seats. Do you think there is and as you said that it doesn't matter, CMs are more important than people. Is there a role of a placebo effect, people get in the political economy, the way people feel very happy about it?
You need a mic. Can you get a mic here? Okay. The question really was, even if Mr. Modi turns out to be not the amphetamine that he is supposed to be, but turns out to be merely a placebo, will there be a placebo effect? After all, it is said that 25%, when they had the Viagra test, they said 75% of those who took Viagra got an erection, and 25% on the placebo also got one. So, can Mr. Modi deliver this kind of placebo effect? Can he galvanize the economy even if he doesn't have the real power? It is possible in the very short run. I said, the truth is, if he gets 220, that would itself constitute such a huge movement of opinion that he would be seen to have a moral force. At that point, we will no longer be seen to be somebody claiming to be an anchor, in fact, when you don't have very much gravitas, right? To 220 would be significant, but still 220 is only 220. As I said, still 50 odd short of majority. He would still have to worry about the others, and you would have to see who are the others and how solidly are they.
So, in any dispensation, you don't see any dramatic shift in the policy or the direction of things?
No, some things can change. But I'm saying there is a structural issue that we have legislated a very large number of laws, which if taken strictly are delaying projects forever.
That's unlikely to change in the short
To
run.
change that would require completely new kinds of legislation or new procedures. I think at the state level it's possible to do some of these things. It's possible to club various things together and, have one committee do it and get relatively, but I think that action will have to be somehow done. That modification is probably best done at the state level. But the proliferation of central laws and the number of you just go through the land acquisition bill, you just read through it and then you say, is it worth attempting to acquire land in this country and start an industry at all? The potential hazards are huge. You don't know what you're getting into. And at the end of it all, the cost is very, very large. I don't know whether you saw the new Bombay airport. So the compensation they are working out, that cost of new airport will be 14,000 crores. Then there's this Dutch company that says, instead of doing that, why don't you just dredge Panvel Creek, fill it up, and for 3,000 crores you have an airport, because you don't have to give compensation to anybody, no farmers, no resettlement. I mean, in some sense, it's a very, very penetrating look into what we have done through these new laws. You have made it extremely problematic and extremely costly to actually do a project. So as they say, better to go offshore. In this case, it's not another country. But you are getting offshore. You dig up that land. And, I mean, Adani's SEZ is succeeding. Most of Adani's land is reclaimed from the sea. At Dholera, he's thinking of another thing. Once again, he's saying reclaim from the sea. Don't deal with human beings. Deal with the fish, deal with the shrimp, deal with the sand. But then you don't run into all these other laws.
What if the status quo continues? You said, given different scenarios, we have a coalition. What if status quo continues?
By status quo, if you mean the Congress party winning and coming back.
So maybe a Chidambaram instead of, let's say, a Manmohan Singh, or a Rahul Gandhi instead of...
Okay, no. Now this is okay. There is nothing more improbable to me than that the UPA comes back to power with this majority. If it comes back down, that again will constitute a revolution. I mean, in the first place, a very large number of editors and opinion poll agencies will have to be sacked. Within the political sphere, it would be a revolution. Certainly Manmohan will not come back. But they will say this once again shows that 10 Janpath has the right idea. There is this mysterious entity, I think only in India that we have, that there is no ruler, but there is a residence called 10 Janpath, which houses the Gandhi family and sundry visitors. And there's enormous speculation on who are the visitors, how influential are they, did they get half a smile out of Sonia, did they get a full smile? On the basis of this, apparently, Indian policy is set. And that mystical 10 Janpath will once again say, we have proved that this is the way to run India, and we would continue with the Sphinx-like situation where nobody really knows what the policy is, and the cabinet can take one kind of policy, shall we say, as happened on that the criminal amnesty bill, and Rahul Gandhi can reverse it tomorrow.
One short question, Swami. Yes. I'm here. The new license permit Raj through allocation of resources, through land reforms, through environment, the mess that we have created, right? How do you think the state chief ministers can do much about it? This all has to be unwound at the central level, the massive mess that has been created, right?
As I said, implementation is always at the grassroots level. There are various tricks that bureaucrats and politicians have of clubbing various things together and getting a thing through. At the end of it all, it may be called a bad decision, but provided it is not a malified decision, it will pass judicial muster. There are summary procedures for various things. I mean, I don't know whether you know, we had got to a stage actually in land acquisition where everything that Mayawati acquired used to be under urgent, a matter of urgent public action. So that was clearly misuse. But there are various ways like that which you can use to, in fact, create a fast track. So I think that is what will ultimately have to happen. The second thing that we will have to beef up our administration. There are some people who say there are too many public servants. That's not true. When you consider the responsibilities that we are asking them to carry out, there needs to be a very, certainly we need far more policemen, we need far more judges, and we need far more jailers. I mean, those three categories, I think we can safely double and we would be below international standards. But equally, all the expert areas for the environmental issues, social impact, for all these issues, a huge amount of expertise is required. It does not exist today. So, we would certainly have to do it two ways. On the one hand, you would have to create capacity which does not exist. And on the other hand, you would have to have fast-track procedures, which enable you to do it in a way which will pass judicial muster.
How would you compare Vajpayee's regime, in which he could really manage a much larger coalition government, and things were happening? And in light of that, the current also rule which can be backed again by NDA one.
At the time that Vajpayee came to power, it was very unclear whether he would have very much power and whether people would listen to him. He solved the problem in a way nobody would have dreamt possible. He exploded an atom bomb. It is incredible. The moral authority he got out of this. Suddenly, fantastic. I mean, in my newspaper, I think there were 7 of us in it. The editorial columns were against the bomb. The management came down on us and said, what are you trying to do? The whole country is for the bomb, only the Economic Times staff seems to be against it. But the huge, so this, Vajpayee created this huge, massive thing behind him, saying he's a decision maker, he has taken this thing. Secondly, I think he was lucky in various ways. The Asian financial crisis was still on, 1998 when he came to power. So, the people willing to say there is a crisis, the Prime Minister has to be given a chance. At the end of it all, let's be clear, 98, his first year, was a difficult year. He didn't have a majority, he couldn't carry, and ultimately the government fell. So it's not as though that first, in 1998, everything was easy for Vajpayee. Then when he got re-elected with this large thing, you see, after atom bomb, then you beat Pakistan in the Kargil war. As people say that if Congress wants to win election, they say do 3 things. You explode a hydrogen bomb, win a quick war with Pakistan, and assassinate Modi or some such combination. These are fantasies. But Vajpayee had this going for him. Vajpayee managed to get authority out of nothing by exploding a nuclear bomb and winning a war with Pakistan. This made a huge difference.
Thank you very much for your time, and it was extreme privilege to be getting your insightful views once again.
May I call Harsha Viji? Harsha Viji, please. So while we are waiting, Swami, I just had one small comment, which is that if the state of governance is going to be the way it is with so many small parties, it's more of an abstract question, which is that isn't it much more democratic than any other time than it is, in terms of giving voices to various people?
There is a difference between giving voice and merely having a number of power brokers. So it could go either way. So it could turn out well, it could turn out badly. Let's see. Thank you very much.